Hi everyone, welcome to Teapot Philosophy. Today I'm going to bring you one of the biggest questions, and we're going to explore arguments around this particular topic, and it's a classic and it's a deeply personal question. However, it's one of the biggest questions that anybody has ever thought of or asked. The question is it reasonable to believe in God without evidence? So it's a big question. It's very deeply personal to everybody. Everybody has lots of different opinions on this, and there is various different ideas, philosophies, thoughts, communities, religious beliefs, and scientific beliefs, and camps in different fields of thought. What we're going to do to look at this, we're going to look at one big analogy, and it's the perfect one for this podcast. In fact, it is why I named this podcast the way that I did, because this analogy really opens up the thought of what is evidence and why do we believe things the way that we do. So it's this analogy is called Bertrand Russell's cosmic teapot. And of course, my podcast is Teapot Philosophy. And it's a way of thinking about what evidence we believe in and what is evidence and how we pull arguments together. So, just to give you a bit of an overview and set the thought before we start, Bertrand Russell and his cosmic teapot gave an analogy of a cosmic teapot that orbited the sun. Okay, so the thought was to imagine that there was this cosmic teapot flying around the sun, okay? And it's sort of positioned in places that you know between Earth and Mars, say. So it's there. Imagine it's there, but there's nothing that can actually link it there. So there's no evidence. You can't see it. You don't know it's there. That there's nothing that scientifically proved that teapot is there. But everyone believes it is. Okay. So the philosopher, so it's Russell, would believe that teapot is actually there, but because you can't see it and you can't think it, you can't prove that it is. And what his analogy is sort of suggesting, if you imagine all that, is that there's somebody who believes it's there, but the evidence isn't. So it doesn't prove that it's there because you can't see it or scientifically evidence it, but you can't prove that it's not. So the idea is basically that just because you can't prove that something exists or not, you can't prove that it doesn't exist. So this is where evidence becomes in question, because you've got qualitative and you've got quantifiable evidence. So you've got stuff that you can scientifically prove because you can see it, feel it, quantify it, and then you've got proof that something exists because of what people have actually thought, believed, and subjectively seen. So it's that whole sort of like bigger argument of what evidence is, and is it reasonable to believe something because that power of thought is there to suggest it does. Okay. So that is half why I've sort of named this podcast the way that I have, because I really want to delve into all those sort of life mysteries, as I've mentioned before in my other podcasts. So let's leave that as a premise for the question that we're posing today, which is it reasonable to believe in God without evidence? And we'll look at the debate now, bearing in mind that we're thinking about this analogy and how we can sort of come to any conclusion. Okay, so that's the premise, that's the setup, that's where we're coming from with this. But I want you to really think now about whether it is rational to believe in the existence of God without empirical proof. Okay, so Russell, let's go back to him now. So in the 1950s, philosopher Bertrand Russell offered the famous analogy, which I've explained, and he sort of suggests that something can't be disproven and something can be reasonable to prove that it is. Okay. He used the analogy mainly to criticise religious belief that relies on faith alone, but yet it insulated itself from disproof. So it's almost like sitting on the fence in a way. So let's start with an argument against belief. So let's start with the skeptical side. So those who would argue against belief in God without evidence that say it undermines rational thinking. Okay, so you have rationalists here like David Hume, who was a great Scottish skeptic, and he said we should only proportion our belief to the strength of the evidence. So belief should be heavily relied on evidence, and evidence in this case, it's more about the rational side of things. And if you believe in God without any evidence, then it's just unproven. And remember, evidence when it comes from the rational side of things, it is about the physicality, knowing that something exists from scientific belief. So believing in things just because they can't be disproven, in Hume's words, would be to believe anything like, I don't know, invisible magical creatures or orbiting teapots. It's like going against the grain of rationality. And from this perspective, belief in God without any evidence is just unproven, it's irrational, it's nonsensical. And this has real consequences if we accept beliefs on no evidence, scientifically, quantifiable, that sort of evidence, the rational evidence. If we start believing in all of this stuff, then we can't draw a meaningful line between what's true and what's not. And this is what mixes up our beliefs of what we know to be scientific proof. Okay. So that's just one example using David Hume. Now, I find David Hume's work fascinating. I'm not sure if I completely agree with a lot of it, but I do think as a philosopher he has some really interesting thoughts. So we go against that and we'll look at the arguments for belief. So this is without that said evidence of rationality. Okay, and you can look at rationality and look at that sort of thought behind it as well, and see where that takes you. So we're flipping the coin now, and we're looking for the strong arguments for why we should believe in God, even without that evidence, and why it can be seen as reasonable. So philosophers like Alvin Plantinga. So excuse me, I've not really come across this philosopher much, but when I've delved into this, his beliefs are probably basic. So what he's suggesting is that you don't have to have proof to believe that the past has happened or that other people have minds. So if we explore this even more, it's about understanding that believing in God is a foundational intuition. It's not irrational, it's sort of pre-rational. And what this means is that it's already there. So it's intuitional, and it's already like an inherent value, if you like. And then there's William James, who said that in certain cases, when a decision is forced, it's unavoidable and it's deeply insignificant. So it's okay to believe without evidence if you apply it to your religious faith. So it's like a knowing. It's like a moral truth, it's empirical, and it's the meaning that you can measure things because of a belief, and where there's no framework that suggests in scientific stuff, the framework can explain love, existence, and purpose. So it's about having an inherent value that offers a purpose. And this is the way that I would present these arguments. So the empirical evidence, which is the evidence of what people's beliefs are, thoughts, their feelings and experiences, builds up a moral truth. And that's why belief can be formed as an evidence to the existence of God. And it's almost like suggesting that there is a power and there is a strength in that moral value that is inherent in us. And if you remember from a podcast that I did last time, so the last podcast, we looked at duality in the soul. So this would suggest that that soul that we all have offers that inherent value that is linked. So evidence is not needed. Okay. Russell's teapot remains a powerful analogy, not because it disproves God, but because it reminds us of the burden of proof. So what that is sort of suggesting is the burden of proof. So like the idea that we have to prove everything relies solely on the person, not as like not like a scientific proof of the universe as a consensus. Okay, so it's just an individual burden that we have to manage ourselves. So proof is what we call it. And if you make a claim that's of some kind of life mystery, okay, so the teapot orbiting around the sun, for example, particularly something that's like crazy like that, then it's up to you to provide that evidence. And this is what we're sort of suggesting in terms of like that moral truth, that inherent value, because that's about one person and your belief and that burden of proof being on yourself to prove it. And that's where it sort of takes off in terms of Russell's teapot analogy, which is why I presented this at the beginning of the argument to really think about that as you're going forward. So it might look as the moment like I'm heavily relying on that empirical side, but I really want you to think about this as a way of analysing both sides of the argument, because it's really easy to think about the scientific version of proof because it's there, we can see it, we can sense it. But if you look at that other side, it's really hard to evidence it. So I wanted to try and create that balance of why it's reasonable to think about that non-evidential stuff in a different way. And I hope I'm putting this argument across enough for you to have two sort of thoughts and beliefs on that. And then we look onwards of like how Russell's analogy may be debunked or criticised. Okay, so we've had a bit of an overview of everything, and now we're looking at how this can be critically analysed. So if you look at Russell and you look at how you can compare his analogy to believing in God, to a believing in a literal teapot in space, it's some would say that's sort of like it's just silly and nonsense and it's disrespectful, and you can have that from both ways. So the evidential stuff from Hume's side will say, well, that's just ridiculous because it's not rational, and then you've got people from the more religious side who are saying, well, that doesn't actually make sense, it's disrespectful and it's just a random object. God is God is morality, and it's it's just consciousness in itself. So you could have two different arguments looking at Russell's perspective, because actually what it's sort of saying is that it can be either or depending on how you individually look at it. And I think that's a way of sort of bringing it together. So looking at all of this and breaking it down and thinking about how we can rationally look at the existence of God going forward, I would land on the perspective of, and similar sort of like to what Russell's saying, that it is reasonable to believe that there is something there in terms of God's existence based on our own individual thought. However, if you want to look at the world as a consensus and you want to think about how we are using a framework to guide us in evidential reasoning, then you would think that actually it's not really something that can be proven. So why would it exist in the first place? Because it's not rational. So my landing point would be actually it can be either or, depending on how you think about it. So I really like the idea of Russell's teapot analogy, hence the reason for the name. But this is down to you, and you've got to go away and come up with your arguments and think about why this would be reasonable. And if you come back with, well, I believe in God, or I believe in science, and they're my reasonings, I would challenge you to break that down and think of it even more. So I would look at maybe Hume and look at his reasoning behind it and look at rationality. But I would also look at other people who really do think about the other elements of evidential stuff. And we've got a couple in here called Alvin Plantinga. Again, I've not really looked much into this person, so I would like to hear your views on this more. And William James, because these people are really going to help you to understand some of the issues around this. And James would look a lot about religious faith. So you could break this down even more and look at this in a way that's going to bolster your opinion really and give you some arguments, or actually make you view things in a different way. What we're not looking for is opinion based without any thought behind it or arguments behind it. We're looking at ways we can break this down and go forward on some kind of thought and argument with maybe a conclusion that has got some rationality behind it. And again, rationality not in Hume's way, but in terms of an argument. So looking at this in terms of, what do you think of Russell's teapot analogy? Does it make sense to you? Do you think that, going back to the title of the podcast in the first place, do you think that God exists based on if there's no evidence to suggest so? And really giving it some extra thought about the burden of proof, and also about whether, this is another thing to think about actually before I finish, whether this is an atheist's point of view in the terms of Russell's analogy, or if there's more to come from this. And I'm not going to give you too much more than that to go on, because I want you to go away and really think about it and give me thoughts 2 and 4, and sort of really break that down. And I hope this makes sense. Please do give me some questions, or if something you want some clarity, do give me something to really look at and we can have further discussions. Thank you for listening, and I hope that you come back to me with some arguments, debates, and some further thought, and then we can look at how we can pull this into some further podcast and discussion. So don't forget, you can email me or you can comment on the details on my YouTube podcast, and I will hopefully speak to you soon, and I'll be back next week with my next podcast. If you've got an idea for what you'd like to look at, please do let me know, and I can incorporate that in future podcasts. Thanks for listening. Have a great day, and I will see you soon, or speak to you soon, or hear you soon, depending where your philosophical thought sits. Bye for now, and take care.